This video is the second half of the factoring lesson from Unit 3, Day 5, and we will cover the Snowflake method. So the Snowflake method is a trick. It's a shortcut. It's not a mathematical fact or concept, but it's a trick that's going to allow you to factor a quadratic, specifically when you see that A does not equal 1. And what that means is that you can't take out a GCF. Or you do take out a GCF, but it still doesn't get rid of your A value. In this particular case, there is no GCF because I can't divide all three terms by any number. So my goal, as with the previous examples, is to rewrite my quadratic as two binomials. And I'm going to go ahead and put the two sets of parentheses at the bottom so I can remember what my answer should look like. The Snowflake method is a shortcut for figuring out what you can put in parentheses here so that these two binomials, when FOILed out, would equal what we start with. To set the snowflake up, you'll draw an X with a line through the middle. At the top, we will multiply A and C from my standard form quadratic. At the bottom goes B, and on the sides, your A values. Your job, when we get there, will be to fill in these two blanks with two numbers that multiply to equal the top and add to equal the bottom. The first step, of course, is just to identify A, B, and C. And these are all numbers that come from my quadratic. In this particular example, A equals 3 because it's the coefficient of x squared. B equals -8 because it's the coefficient of x. And C is the constant, 5. When I take these numbers and plug them in to the snowflake, A times C is 15, which goes up top. B is -8, which goes at the bottom. And A is 3. Now that I have this set up, I'm looking for two numbers. The two numbers will go in these spots. And notice that this is the same reasoning process as with simple factoring. If it helps you to make a list of factors, we would start with the 15. And I know that 15 is the same thing as 1 times 15 or 3 times 5. It could also be -1 times -15 or -3 times -5. If you don't need to do the brainstorm on paper, that's fine. If you get stuck, this is a great way to figure out which numbers should go in these spots. In this case, the two numbers that multiply to +15 and add to -8 are -3 and -5. Those two numbers fill in these two blanks. Now, the beautiful thing about the snowflake is that this little trick or visual tool actually has given you your answer. You just need to know how to interpret them. The answers, which are really two binomials, come from the numbers on the sides of the snowflake. This side and this side. And in general, the top number is going to become the coefficient of x. So for example, on this side, the 3 would become the coefficient of x. And the 5 from the bottom, or the -5, becomes the constant. But there is one little trick, which is if you can reduce these numbers, the same way you would reduce a fraction, you have to do that before you write your final answer. So on the left-hand side, 3 on top and 3 on bottom, well, those numbers can both be divided by 3, just the way you would reduce a fraction. And they actually turn into 1 and -1. Now, it's not really a fraction, so you're not actually changing it into a -1. You want to leave it as sort of a fraction. But when you think of this, instead of 3 over -3, as 1 over -1, those two reduced numbers are the ones that become your answer. And it turns into 1x minus 1. Of course, you could have written these two binomials in the opposite order, just like you could have put -3 on this side and -5 on this side. The order doesn't matter. What does matter is that we now have two binomials that equal the quadratic that we started with, and we can check that by FOILing. Here's what it looks like. 1x times 3x is 3x squared. 1x times -5 is minus 5x. -1 times 3x is minus 3x. And -1 times 5 is positive 5. When I combine my like terms, that gives me the same quadratic that I started with. And that's how I know that this is right. The most common mistake, well, there are actually two. People sometimes forget the GCF. If you could have taken a GCF out, you should always do that first. And just like before, you would write it in front. In this case, there was no GCF. And so there is another common mistake, which is sometimes people also forget to simplify. And when I say forget to simplify, I mean that last step where we took this fraction-like thing and turned it into a binomial. Make sure that if you can reduce these numbers, you do that first. If you need to hear this explanation again, you should pause the video and go back. Otherwise, take a moment to answer the questions below, and I will show you the answers.